I find that sometimes people approach herbs as kind of the fluff in life. You know, they're not really necessary. They're not like a vegetable. But I think what we forget is, one, not only do they, I really see it as a quality of life issue, that they really contribute to really tastiness in our fruits and vegetables and even our meat dishes. And they also pack a nutritional punch. And so this link here is to the publication that Alice Henneman did about just the healthiness of herbs. And so I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that, because it's something that, you know, anybody can do if they've got a mind to do it. And I found them super easy to grow. So they're a really simple thing to get started on. And it can be as simple as, you know, purchasing a pack of seeds if you want to start that basic. And just to clarify, we're talking about herbs primarily tonight versus spices. So herbs are primarily the leaves of things that we're eating that add flavor to dishes. They produce an oil that is very flavorful, and that's what we're tasting when we're putting them in dishes, as opposed to spices, which are primarily seeds, okay? So one of the things that I think of when I think herbs versus spices is cilantro. So if we're eating the leaves of that, it's cilantro, but if we're eating the seeds from it, it's coriander. And dill is kind of one of those too. If you're eating the leaves from it, we tend to call it dill weed. And if it's the seeds, then we just call them dill seeds, you know. We don't go with a totally different name. But there's all different life cycles of herbs, and knowing what is going to be helpful as far as when you're getting started. But all of these, regardless if they're annual or perennial, can be started from seed. So, you know, jump in with both feet if there's something that you think you want to try. And I want to mention pollinators, because when we think of pollinators, you know, a lot of people have, you know, really sweet thoughts of butterflies and all kinds of flitting things going through the garden, helping themselves to the nectar and the pollen in the garden. And they're really not doing much in the way of damage to plants. They're just taking things that we don't even notice is gone. But we can't forget that a lot of the immature stages of some of these pollinators are caterpillars, and they have chewing mouth parts, and those chewing mouth parts are physically eating away at things. And so the upper image is of swallowtail caterpillar on some flatleaf Italian parsley. The lower image is from dill. And they love that family of plants. You'll find them pretty readily there. And I always remember somebody that called one time and was explaining what was happening, and she was telling me, as she's going through the story, about how she's squishing all these caterpillars as she's trying to defend her parsley. And, you know, I'm grabbing the edge of my desk as she's explaining all this to me. And I said, well, you know, you can hurt them to a certain extent. And you can. When I plant parsley, I always plant one plant just for the swallowtails. And so if a caterpillar shows up on a plant that I don't really want them to feed on, I will carefully tear that leaf away and set it in the crown of the plant that I do want them to feed on. So that's how you herd caterpillars. So when we're talking about how to grow them well, just remember, the more light you have, the better you can grow them. So 6 hours is really considered the minimum starting point. Anything more than that is going to give you better production. And so if you can get something that's, you know, in sunlight all day, it's going to do much, much better for you than if something's only getting 3 hours of sunlight per day. And if we're indoors and we're supplementing the light with like grow lights or something like that, then we're going to need about 14 hours. The reason we need it is because the intensity of that light isn't the quality it is as it is outdoors during the summer months. And it's all about getting that quality light that they need in order to produce those oils, in order to have that flavor that we're seeking. So all of those things are connected together to the amount of light. We want a soil that drains really well. And if it doesn't drain well, if it's a really heavy clay, then incorporating some compost or something like that into the soil to lighten it up is going to make a huge difference. a lot of the mint family of plants come from the Mediterranean region. And so very hot, very dry, very well-drained soils. And so when we're mimicking that sort of thing in our landscapes, we want to make sure that we have that for the plants. And I found that one neat trick to having some of those Mediterranean plants make it through the winter is if I tuck those plants kind of underneath, I plant them underneath the eaves of the house so that they still get some rainfall, but they don't get as much rainfall as they would if they were out in the landscape. And the other critical thing is that I found that just snow, as it packs and becomes ice around those crowns, will kill a lot of these herb plants. And so having them underneath the eaves really keeps less snow off those crowns, which helps them make it through the winter better. And then of course in pots, you always should have drainage holes. That's really critical. If they sit in water for any length of time, that's going to be it for much of that. So, and I always think of Master Gardener Connie when she talks about her rosemary plant. And she always says that rosemary is either dead or it's alive. And it's about that simple. Because what I find is that it needs to have the soil kept evenly moist. If it's kept bone dry or sopping wet, you have dead plants. So, you know, it's really critical that you don't have too much moisture. Most of us kill things with kindness, we overwater. And so really having well-draining pots is going to be critical there. And a good rule of thumb is that for every plant you want to grow, so if you want to do a mixed container, or if you just want to do a container with many of the same plant, generally speaking, you need about 1 gallon of soil per plant. And if you're wondering how much it'll hold, you can always cut the top off of a milk jug and fill it with soil and just keep filling it till you know how much you have in a particular container. And then from there, you can just plop in the number of plants that will allow you to go through it. So water, and this may seem a little odd that the temperature makes a difference, but it does. You know, a lot of our water, if it comes out of a well or if it's coming out of the tap, can be pretty darn cold. And most of these plants that we're growing are warm season plants, and they're not going to handle those cold soils or if we're dumping cold water on them. So really, if you're getting the water from a well or other source that's pretty chilly, let that water sit out in a can for a day and then use that water the next day to water your plants with. They're going to do so much better than if you're dumping cold water on them, because it actually sets them back a little bit. If the plants are in the ground, you need about 1 inch of water per week for them to do well. And in pots, we kind of throw out that 1 inch of water per week because it's kind of hard to gauge it. So again, it's kind of an evenly moist sort of thing. There's really nothing more sophisticated than your finger for testing that. So you never touch just the top of the soil. You actually put it in probably to like the first digit. And if it feels moist in that far, don't water because you can, like I said, quickly kill plants off. And then when it comes to fertilization, remember what we're mostly growing here is leaves. And so that nitrogen that's in that fertilizer package that you're using is really what's going to foster lots of leaf growth and have you get a lot of plant or a lot of herb for the plant. And so if you want to do some kind of technique where you're doing just a little bit of fertilization all the time, which really contributes to nice steady growth, then you can do it at 1/4 strength if you're doing a water soluble product. Okay. Any questions on that part? And then this link at the bottom here is just, it breaks out the different herbs by the type of herb it is, and then specific growing requirements. And then it gives you some ideas of where that herb is good to use. Okay, so here's a pretty handy chart that tells you what things are annuals. So they complete their life cycle in 1 growing season. So from seed to harvest is 1 growing season. Has anybody else grown cutting celery besides David?
I have.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool plant, huh? I personally think celery excels at adding flavor. So when you have something like cutting celery that gives you lots and lots of leaves, it's a really cool thing to have, and it's way easier to grow than celery, just regular celery. So you can grow it seeds, plunking them directly into the soil if you'd like, or you can start them early indoors, however you want to do it. And then of course, biennials are those things that complete their life cycle after 2 growing seasons. And you can get into a lot of cool parsleys that way. The tender perennials, so those are the things that are technically perennial, but they're not hardy over our winters. So there's no way you're going to be able to leave them outside and have them make it. And rosemary and bay fall into that category. And thankfully, there's a lot of perennial herbs that you can use. My finding is that these guys weather our winters very nicely. The exception to that would be the sage. My sage, I find that if I can get like 6 to 7 years out of it, and then it just may quietly disappear over some winter, and then I'll have to start all over again. But everything else is really good about coming back. I won't kid you, some of these are monsters. You know, mint can be a really aggressive plant. So I took the advice one time of somebody that said, you know, just knock out the bottom of the bucket, bury the bucket, put soil in it, and plant your mint in there. And that worked for as long as until the mint decided to send runners up over the edge of the bucket and out through that way. So it got away. So a lot of different things can happen when you have mint. And then lovage, this isn't something that a lot of people grow. So the plant itself is like celery on steroids. I mean, the plant easily gets 5 feet tall, and it's a pollinator magnet. They are just all over those flowers when it's in bloom. And the flavor of lovage is very much like, kind of a strong, maybe a strong celery flavor. I don't think that's right really either. Does anybody else have a better description than that? Does anybody else grow lovage? Okay, alrighty then. Well, it's worth growing it just because it's a massive plant and it's really cool to look at. So things that we can do now. So a couple of critical things about harvesting is that we really want to harvest things in the morning. That's when the oil content in the leaves is the highest. We want to do it after the dew has dried. One cool bit of advice I got was that, you know how the undersides of the leaves can catch a lot of dirt on them? If you go out the day before and rinse down the entire plant, you know, if you have a wand on the end of your hose, you know, aim it towards the undersides of the leaves and just thoroughly rinse it off, but leave the plant in place and do your harvesting the next morning. The plant's dripped away, a lot of that water's gone, and a lot of the dirt is gone. So it's a real easy way to harvest. The other thing to keep in mind about harvest is that a lot of these herbs, which seems different to me, but a lot of them will have the highest oil content when they're setting on flowers. And so, you know, it used to be, we thought, oh, when it's flowering, it's taking away from those leaves. Well, that's not the case. So the oils are actually the highest when the plants are starting to flower. Okay. And then you can do all kinds of things to preserve them, whether it's freezing or drying. Probably the exception to drying, for me at least, would be basil. Basil is one of those that if you dry it, it pretty much disappears flavor-wise 100%. So it's really hard to advocate drying it, but it freezes really well in pesto. So if you're a pesto maker and you like that fresh taste through the summer or the winter months, then you can make up a bunch of basil, and it does a really good job of freezing. The only step I would leave out in your pesto recipe is don't put the cheese in it, because say for instance, you take it out of the freezer and you want to nuke it so you can use it real quick. If there's cheese in it, it will congeal into one solid mass, and that's no fun either. So those are some ideas for you as far as freezing and drying goes. A lot of times people will, with basil, they'll put leaves in an ice cube tray, put water in the ice cube tray, freeze the tray, and then pop out those cubes and put them in a Ziploc bag. And then they pop those ice cubes out when they're putting together a soup or a stew or something like that. And I know roasting sounds funny as something to do with herbs, but let me explain a little bit more about that. So roasting, in my house, there is no such thing as too many cherry tomatoes. And that's because I slice them in half, I drizzle olive oil on them, and then I load them up with herbs. And I might put a little salt on them too, and then they go into a cool oven, about 300 degrees. And if it's small cherry tomatoes, you would leave them in there for about an hour. And if they're, you know, like Roma tomatoes, you'd leave them in for more like 2 hours. Bring them out of the oven, let them cool a little bit, pop them into the freezer so they can freeze, and then you can chip them off the tray and put them into Ziploc bags. And they're excellent on pizza. They're really good in pasta with like artichokes and mushrooms and these roasted tomatoes. The flavor really intensifies, so you'll find that the flavor is just really sweet, and then it's just really packing a punch with all those herbs on them. And then of course, you know, next month now would be a good time to start dividing plants if you're thinking about doing that, or if you want to share some. And the critical thing there is that sometimes the very center of these plants can get pretty darn woody. And so when you're digging those up, you'll want to discard that part because that really lacks vigor. And so you can do some of these offsets, replant them, and you're good to go. If you're thinking about bringing in tender plants, David's going to talk to you a little bit more about growing herbs indoors, but you know, that's something that can be on your radar. And you don't want to wait until it gets really cold before you take those cuttings or before you divide those plants to bring them indoors. Mostly because they'll have reduced vigor at that point and they won't acclimate as well to being moved indoors. So make sure you're, you know, considering doing the cuttings or whatever. Early September would be the time to do that. And I can hear you saying that, you know, garlic's not an herb. It shouldn't be on this list here, this to-do list, but it's done so often wrong that I just had to put it in here. So a lot of times when you're purchasing garlic to plant, it's always available at the garden centers in spring. That's not the time to plant garlic. The best time to plant garlic is one of the last things you do before the ground freezes. So if we're talking October, when you're planting the garlic, that's an ideal time to do it. Keep in mind that the largest cloves create the largest heads, and the time to start harvesting on garlic is the following year when the stems start dying back by 1/2 to 1/3. That range is when you're going to dig up the plants, harvest off the bulbs, and then at that point, if you want to save back some of the larger cloves to plant next year, you can do that. Okay. Any other questions? Any questions at all?
Nothing yet so far.
Okay. All right. This is one that really depicts what David was, David provided these slides as far as, you know, you can see what dill weed is. We're talking about those skinny little leaves, really imparting a lot of flavor, great in fish dishes. The immature dill seeds. So they're actually going to pack more of a punch if you wait to the far right image here, where you can see those seeds are fully matured at this point, and they're breaking off, they're falling off when you're trying to harvest them. That's when dill is best utilized. And we were joking the other day about dill is one of those things that you plant once. And after that, it pretty much takes care of itself as far as seeding all over the place. So that's one of the cool things about dill. All right, David.
Okay, thank you. And container herb gardening is something that we can do throughout the year. We can start plants indoors. We can grow them throughout the whole entire gardening season indoors if we like. We have people that don't have space to garden or they don't have the ability physically to move around in gardens. So we can do some great gardening indoors, and herbs are one of those more forgiving plants for the most part. The exception would be like your rosemary and lavender, that either they're alive or they're dead, with that very fine fibrous root system that either dries out too fast or root rots. But it is a plant that we can, a set of plants that we can grow indoors in a variety of containers. 1 gallon is kind of that cutoff as preferred. The picture here on our slide is from my friend Felipe near Seville, Spain, and he's raising different herbs in terracotta, which is very popular in the Mediterranean climate in Spain. And they literally pick things off and they cook with. And so this is showing you the portability of an herb garden. It doesn't have to be in the ground if you don't have the space, or maybe you want to bring it in and out. So it's highly portable. You can move it in. And how many times have we had a horrible storm come in and there's things that we would love to bring in? Well, a container herb garden is one that you can drag into a safe haven until the storm has passed. And that works out extremely well. So that's one of the best things about that. And if you've ever priced herbs in those plastic packages at the grocery store, they are quite expensive. And you can grow your own container of herbs and tailor it towards the type of herbs that you like and have them available, and you control the growing process for a very nominal fee versus buying something that by the time it comes out to North Platte usually isn't in the best shape, and there's not much variety. So that's one thing that we have found as a way to have an alternative where you can actually control having more variety in your diet by growing these herbs and having them available, especially in parts of the state where you don't have a lot of variety in buying fresh at the grocery store or at a farmer's market. So that's always something we have to think about here in the lightly populated areas. We also do themed herb containers where you can put 2 or more herbs together in a container, and that's something that I have worked with our West Central Health Department, with our Latino beginning gardeners, and they help select their herbs that they raised. And so we did, ironically, a pizza garden pot, which we had parsley, oregano, and basil in, and we divided the container in kind of like a pie wedge shaped, and we started our seeds, and we would harvest them off, and we would take scoops out of the starts so they could go and they could grow their own, and worked out really good. But things related to Mexican food, Mexican cooking, those herbs are good combinations to put 2 or more together. We have, of course, the Italian version. When we talk about the pizza, of course, that's a home run for a lot of people, but you can pick out spices that have combinations that have more of an Asian set of flavors, or depending on where you grew up with people from the Czech Republic, where I grew up, they grew a lot of dill, they grew a lot of fennel, they grew those kind of things. So you can put those groupings together in a container or sets of containers, along with being in the garden as well. And it's also a great way to control invasive herbs. And so the first thing we talked about was mint that grows everywhere. It's I call a garden gremlin. It pops up in places that you didn't think it would, or maybe it's places you don't want it. So you can grow, your chocolate mint or your orange mint or the different varieties of those very aggressive herbs in a container, enjoy it, harvest off of it. You can use it as an annual, let it die and throw it out and then start over again, or you can keep that mint going year round. So that's really awesome. So it makes a big difference. And so if you're a tea drinker, for instance, and you have a certain type of mint that you love, this is perfect. Or if you like your mojitos, or if you like a mint julep, that's perfect. So that is something that is great. So if you want to advance the slide, Kathleen. I'll show you some of the information that we have from our garden here in North Platte. This is one of my master gardeners, Ben Swedberg, and we were growing container herbs. And you can see that these are drainage flower pots. And we put the potting soil in, potting media, and we moistened it. We measured out our herbs and our herb seed. And of course, we can make those designer combinations, or we can do one herb in the container. So a couple things about herbs. There are some herbs that are very large in seed size, such as our coriander seed, which, you know, it would be a spice if we were using it for the seed, or cilantro if we're raising it for the herb. That's a big seed to work with. Or you can have something teeny-eeny like Greek oregano here that looks like just little black pepper specks in your hand. And so we use a variety of different things to help measure that out. We have those little seed dials with the little spout that we can kind of bump that along and try to get it evenly spaced out. We've also used and stored seeds in specimen cups. If you see those cups with the blue lids, I bought a quantity of those to hold seed in. You can put your seeds in the container and you can write the name on it with a Sharpie, and that's one good way to store seed when you're done. So that works out really good. So once you get your seed onto your moist soil, we put plastic wrap on there, tape down the sides, and then we have a grow light. And our grow light here in the picture is one with the clip that I bought at a garage sale. And you can also buy desk lamps. They work great. And I saw the discussion about good potting soil, good potting mix. You get what you pay for on quality, and so you want something that's really well drained with your potting mix, so it's really important to do that. So I'm glad that's being brought up. The light bulbs are very interesting. This is an LED grow light bulb that I bought at a hardware store here in town. You can buy the regular grow lights that shine the white, more the cool white, or you can do these LEDs. And I've had people drive past my office and see the purple glow of my grow light on my house plants. And the idea is to have that light cascade down on those, on that environment to help get them going, that they've got the right wavelength of light so they're not stretching too much. Because if we don't have that supplemental light and we don't have it close down, your herbs will stretch and kind of fall all over themselves. But this little bulb is easy to purchase. You can find it here in rural western Nebraska. You can definitely find it on the eastern half of the state, and it works great just in simple desk lamps. And I'll show you my desk lamp. This is another $1 wonder from our Facebook marketplace here in North Platte. And I just turned that on, and there you got that purple glow. So works out really good. So you can buy the expensive lights, or on a desktop with a small container, you can train that neck down and get that nice coverage all down to keep that growth nice, the internodes as short as possible and as thick as possible. We talked about temperature needs. The base temperature for daytime herb growth is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The range 65 to 70. If you can get it, that internal environment, that growing environment to be 75, that would be more optimal. So, you know, if you place your container in a sunny area plus the supplemental light, that will help, because you'll have a warmer temperature in a sunny area in your home or in your shop outbuilding with your light than just sitting in an office like here that gets really poor quality light, very poor quality foot candles. So they like it warm, and so we need to provide that warmth. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, herb gardening with children. I have worked with herb gardening with Leslie Crandall. There's a picture of her. She is now retired. She was an early child extension educator based out of Holdridge, and we did training for childcare providers, and it was a very great experience for teaching them as part of their in-service. But it's a great way to get kids started with nature, working with big seeds such as your cilantro that, first of all, herbs are generally pretty fast growing. Once they germinate, you can take that saran wrap off and they'll start to come up and take off. And they'll get to see something quickly, because kids are always asking, when am I going to see something? And so it'll pop up and they'll start to take off. The other thing with doing an herb garden in containers, or especially in containers, is that it is portable again. You can start them in the winter or the cool months in early spring and then take them out. They can be under the overhang. They can be on the porch or a protected area or out in the sun. You just got to make sure that they stay moist, not too wet, not too dry. In general, Kathleen and I agree that herbs, for the most part, are forgiving plants, meaning that people can handle them. They can rub them between their fingers and smell them. They can literally pluck them off, pluck leaves off, and they regenerate themselves. And herbs, if you want to keep them nice and dense, you need to be trimming them. So otherwise, they'll just keep on growing and growing until they bolt, and then they have a tendency to flop. The next thing that's really great working with childcare providers and also children is that herbs are non-toxic materials. That if you think about plant materials, which we talk about house plants that are poisonous or landscape plants that are poisonous, and they certainly are there. But herbs are one that you can control something that's non-toxic. So if it is ingested, it may just give nothing more than a tummy ache. So that's one of the fun things. And they're a great introduction to nature in the sense that we can talk about, what plants need to grow. They need the soil, they need the sun, the sunlight, they need the warmth out of the sun, they need the water, they need nutrients. And so we can talk about that in a portable environment to grow around. And if you can incorporate the herbs as part of the cooking, that is great. Also, on the other spectrum, I've worked with herb gardening in nursing homes and retirement communities where people really enjoy getting out to be in gardens that are raised, that are elevated. Either they're in big whiskey barrels or they are raised bed gardens that are accessible for wheelchairs and for walkers. And, feeling the touch, the textures, the colors, it really does make a difference. People really enjoy those activities. So I've had fun teaching those in nursing homes as well as working with young children. So it's a set of plants for all ages. It's really great stuff. Okay, next slide. Then we have our questions. We have our contact information here. And Kathleen's information, she's in Fremont and Dodge County, and I'm in North Platte in the Lincoln, Logan, and McPherson Extension office with our office numbers and our emails. So we are more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. One thing that I was also going to suggest on herb seed before I forget. Now, this isn't an herb seed, this is a tomato seed, but I wanted to show you an example of what coated seeds look like. This is a tomato that has coated seeds. You can order herbs that has a seed coating to it, so it makes it easier to handle. And that's a trick that also works for all ages, because when you work with teeny oregano that looks like pepper flakes, it'd be a lot more helpful if you had something that you could get your hands on a little bit easier. But herbs are a great plant. They're used for so many things. Culinary wise, they can be part of the landscape. They attract so many pollinators, which is good for the environment. So it's just a win-win for everyone. And we have lots of resources beyond our slide set that we'll be happy to share with you.